All right.
Hello and welcome to the final lecture in the NeuronTalks series for June. Today it is my pleasure to host Martin Walchshofer, the hardware and software developer from g.tec Medical Engineering, who is also a specialist in doing backflips. The title of today's lecture is Unicorn, the Brain Interface Hard and Software Introduction. As always, I encourage the audience to ask any questions in the comment section. Thank you for joining us, Martin, and the floor is yours.
Hello, nice to meet you again. As mentioned already, my name is Martin Walchshofer, and I'm software developer at g.tec, and I'm mainly working with the Unicorn system. And that's also what my talk will be about. I will present some basic principles of PCIs, telling you something about the Unicorn system, and I'm also trying to do some short PCI demos later on. So on the main slide, you can already see the Unicorn system. It's this cap with 8 electrodes. And I'm starting with some PCI principles. So in general, there are different types of PCIs available. We have invasive PCIs, where you implant some electrodes. But the disadvantage is you have to open the scalp, and then you can implant some electrodes like ECOG grids. These are electrode grids with up to a couple of hundred electrodes that you place on the scalp. Or you could have some spike electrodes. You can also see that on the image there. That's very nice for invasive PCI because you get a very good resolution, time resolution, and also temporal resolution. But the disadvantage is that it's not very user-friendly to take off the scalp and so on. So you won't do that without any medical indications like epilepsy or tumors or something like that. We use such systems for epilepsy mapping or tumor mapping, where we try to support surgeons to map the cortex. Like if a patient has a tumor, for instance, the scalp can be opened and we place some electrode grids in there. And then the patient is awake during the surgery, and we map the auditory cortex, for instance, to support the neurosurgeon. If he cuts there, he knows that the patient is likely to not hear anymore, but the tumor is gone, and then they can make some better decisions for surgeries, for instance. So that's one use case where we use ECOG, but it's not used for any consumer-grade PCIs at all. So most of the PCIs are non-invasive because that's more user-friendly, and you can also use that for a wide range of applications. And for the non-invasive PCIs, there are two main types that can be differentiated. Like there are EEG-based PCIs. That's something like the Unicorn, where we measure small electrical potentials. And there are optical or light-based systems like the FNIRS, for instance. There you basically see the blood oxygenation in the brain. And there are some differences with light-based PCIs. You have a slower time resolution. Like it takes some time until blood flows into a brain area and the oxygenation rises. For the EEG, we measure the electrical potentials, and that's a little working a little faster, and it's a little bit more responsive. And for EEG systems, we also have a couple of different possibilities. Like there are dry systems. You basically just put on the PCI and you're ready to go. But the disadvantage is you usually get more artifacts into your signal because of many reasons. Like usually you have a higher impedance, so you get more signals that you don't want to measure, more artifacts. And they are a little easier to disturb. So for a lot of research applications or clinical applications, gel is added to the PCI, so you get a cleaner system, cleaner signal. And there are hybrid systems, like with the Unicorn. You can use the Unicorn electrodes with and without gel, depending on your use case. Like if I'm sitting at home alone and nobody else moving around, then I can also use it without any gel. But often if I'm in a crowded environment and I need good signals, then I add some gel. And yeah, the Unicorn is a EEG system with hybrid electrodes, and here are some technical specs. So you can measure EEG signals with a 24-bit resolution. That's the amplitude resolution that we have. We need such a high resolution because we want to measure EEG in the microvolt range. And we have 250 hertz. That's useful because most of the EEG signals for surface EEG are in the frequency band from, I'd say, 0.5 to 50 hertz. And you need a little higher sampling rate to be able to measure these signals. And then we apply some strategies like oversampling and so on to increase our signal to noise ratio, because noise and artifacts are very critical parameters for BCI applications. For the Unicorn, we have 8 electrodes. I already wear a cap like that, and you can see that, I mean, I don't know if you can see it well, but there are 8 electrodes placed all over the cortex. 3 electrodes to 4 electrodes are placed on the visual cortex, so we can do visual BCI experiments. Then there are 3 electrodes placed over the motor cortex, that's in between the ears. And we have 1 electrode a little bit more to the frontal lobes that could be used for EUG or for emotion tracking or similar paradigms. So we place the electrodes that way because these are the most commonly used BCI paradigms. I'll talk a little bit later about the possible applications that you can build with the Unicorn. And for the Unicorn, we tried to get a bit out of the medical field that we usually use our BCI systems in, to allow people to create more customizable tools and more hardware software tools. So we can bring it a little bit more into the programmer, developer, maker scene and make it available for more people, because also the medical devices are pretty expensive, because we need a lot of certifications and have to meet a lot of legal requirements. So here you can see the Unicorn device. You can see the amplifier on the right-hand side. That is where all the analog signals are collected and acquired and then sent via Bluetooth to a computer. And you can see that there are some cables where you go to the 8 electrodes. And these electrodes have these spikes, so you can get through the hair and touch the skin layer perfectly. Here's a little more detailed view of these electrodes. You can see that there's a snap connector and a hole in the middle. That's where you can add some gel in case you want to use gel for your application. And if you don't want to use gel, then you just apply the electrode without putting gel in through the hole. So that's what a typical EEG looks like. So for surface EEG, we usually measure EEG waves in between plus minus 20 microvolts. That's the amplitude range that is usually interesting for EEG. And the majority of the signals is in a frequency range within 0.5 to 50 hertz. At least for the most typical BCI experiments, this frequency range is sufficient. And we usually have to deal with some major artifacts if we're working with EEG, like we're having a power line hum. Depending on your geolocation, it's like 50 or 60 hertz. That is usually way bigger than the EEG, so you have to remove it from the signal. Like typically it's in the couple of hundreds microvolt range to millivolt range, and EEG is in the microvolt range, so that's why you have to remove these signals in order to see EEG. Then we have EOG artifacts. These are typically coming from the eyes. I can make a short software demo later on, so you could also see this type of artifacts later. Then we have EMG artifacts. They are often originated from the chin muscles. Sometimes you also see ECG artifacts, especially when working with dry electrodes. They might be coupled in sometimes. Sometimes you see eye blinks and DC offsets. These are all artifacts that are in the frequency and amplitude range of EEG. That's why it's quite tricky to get rid of all these artifacts and work with clean EEG, especially because all of these artifacts have a very high amplitude. And the EEG has such a small amplitude, so you need to find some special strategy for each type of artifact. But for most of the signal pre-processing, we use a 0.5 to 50 hertz bandpass because that's sufficient for most of the BCI experiments, and some 50 and 60 hertz notch filters according to your geolocation. And for BCI experiments, you usually have this feedback loop where you have a subject and then you're measuring some EEG. And then you have the brain-computer interface that is extracting some control signal. And then you have this feedback loop where you're controlling something like a motor or a device or something else that gives the user a feedback, and that's typical for BCI applications, that you have this feedback loop. And now I'm coming a little bit to the possible features that you can measure. So I guess from literature, a lot of people know delta, theta, alpha, beta, and gamma bands. So one feature that you can extract is a band power feature, and you can check different frequency bands and activations in these frequency bands. On the left-hand side, you can see the frequency bands in the time series. So you can see that from the bottom to the top frequency band, the frequency is becoming higher and higher. So it looks like more and more noisy, the signal. And each of these frequency bands have some typical actions that how you could trigger them. Like delta frequency band is usually triggered when you're asleep, or the theta band is usually triggered when you're in like a intermediate step in between being awake and being asleep, or if you're daydreaming, or if you're doing creative work and stuff like that. Alpha band is usually triggered when you close your eyes, for instance. Then the neurons on your visual cortex synchronize, and you're usually seeing some alpha frequencies, typically around 10 hertz. That's what you can also see on the right-hand side in the frequency plot. The blue line was recorded when I had my eyes open, so there's no peak at 10 hertz. And when I closed my eyes, the orange line was recorded, so there's a peak at 10 hertz, and that shows that there's some increased power in the 10 hertz frequency band. So that's typically alpha frequency. And the higher the frequency becomes, the more task-oriented it is. That means, like, if you're very focused and doing some specific task, then you might find some beta or gamma activity in this after doing the action. Like if you're doing some calculation work and so on, it's very likely that beta band is increased. Exactly. And another type of signal that we often use in BCI are evoked potentials. That's basically the reaction to a stimulus. And in this example here, an optical stimulus, like you're looking at the flickering item that is blinking from time to time very slowly. That's the single stimulus on the top. So after each time the stimulus is blinking, a reaction is triggered in the brain. So the signal goes from the eye via the optical nerve through the thalamus and to the visual cortex, where you have the activation. And if you're doing that more often, like with a certain frequency, in between 6 to 30 hertz, somewhere around these frequencies, then you will find some SSVP. That's basically that the EEG signals are synchronizing, and you're seeing this exact same frequency as from the stimulus in the EEG that again. Like if you have a 10 hertz flickering and you're looking at the screen, then you find a 10 hertz frequency component in the SSVP signal. And the third type of visual stimulation that we can use for PCI is CVAP. That's basically that you're having a code-based stimulus, and you're also finding the same code in the EEG again. So these are 3 different types of evoked potentials that can be used for PCI applications. And here you can see how this would look like for a P300 application. Like in this example, there are a lot of grayscale images, and there's one image of a blonde lady. And whenever the blonde lady is displayed, a P300 is triggered in your brain. You can see that on the right-hand side, what the signal would look like if you average this a couple of times. And that's also something I may have forgotten to mention previously. As you can see on the right-hand side, these EEG signals that we are acquiring, they are very small. Like in this case, they're ranging from -4 to 6 microvolts. So not even 10 microvolts. That's why you have to repeat the task pretty often and average the results. Otherwise, you would just see some noisy signals. And if you're averaging, in this case, I think we did like 100 repetitions for 25 subjects, then you see this very nice ERP signal on the right-hand side. You can see at around 200 to 300 milliseconds, you can see the VEP and the P300 signals very nicely. You can also see that there are multiple lines. This was recorded with a unicorn with the 8 channels that we have. And we use this paradigm, for instance, for our gaming interface, for the Unity interface. And I'd like to show how this could be integrated in a game. On the video right now, you can see the training mode. So the subject is right now looking at this dot that is blinking around once a second. And whenever the blink appears, some response is triggered in the brain. And first of all, we need a short training period in between 30 seconds to a minute. Then we can apply some machine learning, and the system should learn what it looks like if you're focusing on something. And after the training, you can see that there are 10 elements, and they are all flashing after each other. And you can see a blue line, a blue circle around the dot. And this indicates where the subject should look at. And the white circle indicates what the PCI actually measured and is selecting. So in this video, you will see that the blue line is jumping from one dot to the next one, instructing the subject to look at this dot. And when it's selected with the PCI, the white circle appears and the blue circle jumps to the next item. So right now the subject is looking at the first icon, and after some time, the blue cycle will jump to the next. And now the task is to focus on the second one, and if it's selected by the BCI, the white circle appears. So you can see that the subject is also able to hold it nicely with the BCI. Now he has to focus on the next cycle. And again, he has to hold it for, I think it was around 5 seconds before jumping to the next one. So this is a very basic demo, but I will show later on how this principle could be used to be integrated into a game. So we use this experiment to get some metrics for our BCI system, for a 10-class BCI system. And that's what you can see down here. We tried to use this BCI with gel and without gel, and we reached 100% accuracy. So that means the subject was able to select all 10 objects with the BCI, and the information transfer rate is representing how fast he was able to select something. And we calculated around 60 bits per minute. And we got similar results for dry and for gel. And that already shows that you can get similar performance with dry and gel BCIs. But with dry BCIs, you just have to take a little bit more care that you're in a quiet environment, that not too much people are moving around you, and so on. So you really get some quality EEG, and then you should be able to receive similar results. And the second paradigm we did there was the CVAP. That's the code-based visual evoked potential. And with this, we achieved a little higher number of classes and a similar little higher information transfer rate. So in general, I also want to give you a short overview about BCI applications that we currently do. So we have g.tec is in general producing brain-computer interfaces, and we have a lot of BCIs that are used for medical applications that have medical certifications and so on. So we can also use them in the medical environment. The Unicorn would not be such a system because it doesn't have medical certification. But the other amplifiers, we use them, for instance, for assessment of coma patients. That's what you can see on the right down image. This system is called Mind Beagle because it's like a beagle sniffing for brain activity. And typically, we apply a BCI to a coma patient, and we don't know if the depth of the coma patient. So that's what this system is trying to assess, like in a more objective way. Then some stimuli are applied to the patient, like sometimes we apply vibroprotectors to the wrist of the patient and check if there's a brain response if they vibrate. And if there is a brain response, we at least know that the stimulus is going to the brain and there's some reaction. And then some clinician instructs the patient to only focus on the left or the right wrist. And if that also works, then we know that the patient is not only reacting to the stimulus, he's also understanding the task to react to a stimulus and ignore the other one. That's what you can see on the right-hand side. So there's a blue line that's happening for the stimulus that the patient ignores. And the green line is triggered when the patient reacts to something. And in this case, we can establish a very simple communication, like a yes or no questioning with the BCI, where the coma patient can answer by focusing on a wrist and ignoring the other one. Yeah, and also it makes it easier to assess coma patients in a more objective way, because like usually you just have some clinician tests, but not including the brain, and it's hard to tell in what stage of coma the patient actually is. And it turned out that a lot of coma patients are way more responsive than being thought beforehand. So this is something that we do in a clinical environment. We also have a stroke rehabilitation system where the people use motor imagery. They have to think about wrist motions or movements, even if they cannot perform it anymore. And additionally, they are stimulated with some current, so the wrists are really moving. And it turned out that a lot of people are learning and training to get some motor movement back. And originally, BCIs were created for ALS and locked-in patients. So these patients, they completely lost their motor actions, but they can still look at the screen. And with the BCI, you can establish some communication with the outer world again. There's also research in the direction of ADHD or the ADHS. And I mentioned already previously, for invasive BCI, we mainly use them for neurosurgery as a support for tumor or epilepsy patients for cortex mapping. And the unicorn is mainly used in the non-medical field. So the major applications there are research and education, I'd say. So a lot of people are using them at the university to learn about all these signals like ERPs, CVEP, SSVP, and so on. Lately, we explored game development a little bit more. So that's what you can see in the upper right corner. That's a game where I can show a video later on. And another application that came up lately is neuromarketing, where you're trying to check the brain response according to some advertisement, for instance. Now I'll go a little bit more into depth for the unicorn system, and I'd also like to make a short demo later on so you can see how this hardware and software system would work together. So this is basically the whole setup. So we tried to make it as reduced as possible and mobile as possible. So you just have an amplifier, an EEG cap, some electrodes. If you want to use gel, you could also use gel, and the computer. That's the basic setup. And for makers, we also created a do-it-yourself version where you just get the PCB and you can create your own BCI. We still use these medical caps because they just show to work perfectly for all kind of head shapes. And it's very hard to build something that is working for all kind of people. But if you have an idea, you could use the DIY version and build your own mechanical structure for the BCI. And here are some examples where people use this BCI for their own applications, like some very famous BCI researcher, Robert Ostenfeld. He created his own connector and his own electrodes using the Unicorn DIY version. And here's another use case where someone built a 3D printed case that you can mount to some mechanical structures. The Unicorn is used by a lot of different research institutions already, and hopefully by more in future. And here are some fields where the Unicorn has been used so far. Like the first one for makers and so on, and students, and for a lot of projects. So on the very top one, that was a project that I did in my free time. We built a gin tonic robot where the robot was creating cocktails. We did that for a festival called Robo Exotica, and the cocktail was reacting to your brain waves. So if you had more alpha waves, you've been very relaxed and you got a light gin tonic to stay relaxed. And if you had a lot of beta waves, you got a more strong gin tonic to calm down. So that's a funny application that we did in our free time. We had some people using it for digital art, like Alex Guevara, who did some very nice visualizations that were reacting to the brain waves. A lot of people have used the unicorn to control all kinds of robots, and on the very top you can see another artist who controlled a very big cooker robot, or we also controlled a digger at some festival at some time. So there have been many robots being controlled by BCI so far. And on the bottom side, you can see the actual start of the whole unicorn project. We worked together with Anouk Wittrecht, and she wanted to create the BCI for children with ADHD. And her idea was to turn on the camera and record what triggered the ADHD children to focus on something. But at this time, we didn't have any hardware that could support her use case for an acceptable price. And that's why we started to develop a cheaper, more consumer-oriented BCI. And we use the unicorns for a lot of hackathons, like to get in touch with researchers and developers and all kind of people and get some feedback what is actually required for a consumer grade BCI, because we are mainly oriented in the medical field, and like researchers and users and actually consumer grade users are probably using some very different tools. And also we try to react to that feedback and create tools for other programming languages or environments and so on. So that was basically the hardware side, and I'd also like to give you a small insight about the stuff that is already available for the unicorn from the software perspective. Like we have the unicorn recorder that is basically a tool for recording EEG, but you can also stream it out into an external application. You can record CSV and PDF files, and you can send triggers to that software. We have the unicorn band power tool that is basically calculating alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and theta waves. Then we have some games, some small game demos like the Brain Buddy game, the platformer game, and the puzzle game. They integrate the ERP or CWeb paradigm, and you can control some games with the BCI there. Then we have a unicorn speller that was originally created for ALS patients who were not able to control something with their hands, but they could still look at the screen, and then they could select letters from a matrix and write words by selecting one letter after the other. And they use the same principle for paintings, for creating paintings. The Unicorn Blondie Check is a neuromarketing application where you can present images and track the response to that image. And it's called Blondie Check because the first paradigm we did was with a blonde lady and everybody reacted to the face. So that's why it's called Blondie Check. And then we have a lot of APIs for developers. We have a .NET API for C# developers, C API, so you could go to any other programming language. We have a Simulink interface, a Python API, some network APIs if you want to make something a little more high level. And the latest add-on was the Unity interface for creating games. And on our GitHub, we have some tools available that are open source, so you can modify them for your individual purpose, like the UDP LSL interface. We have shown how to integrate raw data into the Unity, a Linux API. We have some Unicorn recorder datasets, so you can use them for offline processing. Some APIs for Raspberry Pi, Unicorn Speller, Unity interface. If you want to create your own API for whatever programming language that we cannot support at the moment or platform, you can integrate the Bluetooth API, an Android API, and for some mechanical drawings for the DIY version. And finally, I want to show you one of the games as a video, and later on I'll continue with some live demo for the Unicorn device. So here you can see 3 different games where we integrated the BCI to control something, like a Pac-Man game where you could stop the enemies by looking at one of these flickering boxes. The Brain Body game was developed during a hackathon for impaired children. So the idea was that 2 children are working together. One is controlling the BCI and is able to change the environment, and the other one was controlling the keyboard. And only if they worked together, they could complete the game. And we have this platformer game that's a very similar concept to the Brain Body game, just in a 3D environment and with CWeb. And here I'd like to show you the Brain Body game. So the task was to focus on this flashing item, and that triggers the ERP response that I've talked about previously. And when you were looking at this blinking dots, the BCI action was triggered and you were able to change the environment. So right now you could not jump over the gap, but if you look at the blinking dot, the bridge should appear and you can continue, but you cannot continue until you select the next blinking dot. And only if you were able to control the BCI perfectly, you were able to reach the limit there. Yeah, so that's it for the presentation. And now I'd also like to show you shortly how this software environment would look like and how you can check if you're really measuring EEG or not. And therefore, I'd like to show the Unicorn recorder. That's a software in the Unicorn suite. And I have already applied the Unicorn to myself. And I'm going to open that one. So right now I'm recording very raw EEG without any filters, and you can already see that you see nothing. And that's why we need some filters. So right now we have DC offsets and all kinds of artifacts in the signal. If I apply a bandpass filter from, let's say, 0.5 to 50 hertz or 1 to 50 hertz, then the DC offset is removed. But you can still see there's some very noisy signal, especially on the first channel, and that's the power line hum. I'm in Europe, that's why we have a 50 hertz power line hum. And if I add that filter, that one is also gone. And we can also apply a cascading 50 and 60 hertz filter that removes 50 hertz and all the multiples. And you can see the signal looks way cleaner now. And now I'd like to show you how you can test if you're really looking at EEG. Like I said that there are a couple of artifacts that we could trigger. So I could trigger eye blinks. So I'm blinking right now, and you can see, especially on the first channels, you can see the eye blinks because the first channel is very close to my eyes. That's why I can easily add some EOG or electrooculogram artifacts there. Or I told you that there are muscle artifacts like EMG artifacts. They usually appear if I'm speaking. You can already see that slightly, or if I'm clenching my teeth, then you will see them more frequently. So they have a very high amplitude and high frequency, so they are very bad. So if you see them in your signal while doing BCI experiments, you should try to relax your jaw and sit straight. Then they will be gone. So these are all artifacts because it's very hard to see actual EEG signals with the raw eye. But there's one signal that we could try to trigger, and that's alpha waves. So if I'm closing my eyes, my visual cortex should relax, and especially on the last few channels, we should see some high amplitude and low frequency signals. So I'll do that now. And you can already see that there are some higher amplitude but lower frequency swings, and these are really alpha waves. So that's actually a real EEG signal. And all the other signals that I've showed previously are actually artifacts, and you usually don't want to have that in your system, in your signal, when you're trying to do a BCI experiment. Yeah. So this tool is mainly used to record data, to do some offline processing, and for research use cases. But I'd also like to show you an actual BCI application where we have a task and some feedback and so on. And therefore, I'd like to show the g.tec shortly. That's this neuromarketing tool based on ERPs. So I checked the EEG signal and it's still fine. And in this case, the system learns how to differentiate if I'm looking at grayscale images or at the blonde lady. So the blonde lady is the target and will trigger some reaction in my brain. So training takes about 1.5 minutes. So I will stop talking and try to sit as still as possible so I get some good ERP responses. All right, now the training is done and I can do a test if the system is really able to do what it is supposed to do. Therefore, again, looking at the screen. And here we can get the results. So after a couple of repetitions, we reach 100% accuracy. And now we can check if that is really working by doing some image ranking. So after 5 repetitions, I should have 100% accuracy. And if I click start ranking now, then you can see the grayscale images are ranked to the lower ranks, but the blonde lady is ranked to the first place. So that shows that the BCI system is really able to differentiate if I'm looking at the face or at the grayscale image. And we can also modify that a little bit more and add some more faces. And the idea would be that hopefully most of these faces are ranked to the higher ranks, while the grayscale images are ranked to the lower ranks. So you can see the trend. It's not 100% accurate, but you can see that rank 1, 2, 4, and 6 are faces, and rank 9, but the majority of the faces are in the higher ranks, and the majority of the grayscale images are in the lower ranks. And that's the principle of the Blondie check, and it's a neuromarketing app. So the idea is you don't necessarily have to train for faces versus grayscale images. You can create your individual picture set of logos that you like versus you don't like, for instance, or food that you like that you do, or you don't like, or faces that you know versus faces that you don't know. So there are a lot of different possibilities to check if your brain can differentiate two things and if you can calculate that as well from the software. And yeah, one application would be neuromarketing, for instance, to design a logo that people like or don't like according to your brain response. So I see that we are already 10 minutes before the end of the talk. So yeah, then I'm going to stop here and I'm open for questions.
Okay, thank you for the lecture. And it is certainly comfortable, the unicorn, because you've been wearing it for an hour now.
Yeah,
So yeah, it is comfortable.
yeah, it's good.
And I
Like,
think that it is worth mentioning what you told me like earlier, like how you managed to lower the price of the unicorn.
yeah, like a lot of PCI systems are pretty expensive, and one of the main reasons if you use it in medical environment is that you need a lot of certifications. And for the unicorn, we don't have a medical certification, so you cannot use it for medical applications. But therefore, we are able to lower the price a bit, and you can still do a lot of projects, games, and research applications because they don't need require medical certification. But if you want to go to the medical environment and do something with patients, you will need a medical amplifier, and they are a little bit more expensive then.
Yeah, but it certainly helps to like the process of spreading the BCIs across the world. So I think that is
Yeah,
great.
sure. Like for education, for research, for all kind of projects, that's perfectly fine to not use it in a medical environment.
And I do have one question. Like, did you have to count the number of the number of times the blonde flashed on the screen during the test?
In this application, it's not really required. There are applications where we do that. That's usually when we have an oddball paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
But for this flashing thing, it's funny because we tried to trick the system as well to count the wrong times to trigger the P300, but it still works. So I think it's more or less automatic that our brain is trained to recognize faces. So we did a study a while ago for a P300 speller where we had icons just changing color, and that worked pretty well. But when we had faces flashing, it worked even better. So we guessed that our trains are kind of trained to recognize faces. That's also why the Blondie-Check has this face image as a default paradigm, so you can really see that it's working well. But it could also be a man or some other guy. Like faces and color is a very good stimulus.
Do you know, like, actually, what does this counting the flashes stem from? Because I've been trying to really get to the source, but it's kind of hard.
Yeah, the counting is usually to tell people that you have to focus on that one, so they're not drifting off with their minds. Like for the P300 speller, for instance, it's sometimes very hard to know why it's not working. But if you give people a simple task like count how many times the B flashes, then it's easier for them to do the correct thing. And for the Blondie-Check, it's very easy because you just have one image filling the whole space. But if I can show the speller shortly, it's a little harder to tell people where to look. If you're looking at a matrix like this, then we just tell them, if you want to select the T, look at the T and count how many times it flashes and ignore all the other stimuli. So it's more a simple task so people do less errors.
Maybe focus more, do not get distracted.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I do have one question about, because you are constantly showing the signal quality, and how are you actually measuring? Is it based on an EEG signal or the impedance?
Like this one is actually based on EEG signals. Like impedance is especially if working with dry electrodes, a bit hard to estimate, because dry electrodes anyway have higher impedance and often are used with active amplifiers and so on, and then impedance is not the best guess, I'd say. And here we just check if the signals are in the correct amplitude and frequency range, and if so, we say the signal is good enough for BCI work. And you can see if I'm shaking my head, then they immediately turn red, but if they return to the to a good signal quality range, they turn green again. And also if I'm blinking, the frontal channels will become bad, and so on. So I think for most BCI applications, that's a good enough indicator.
So should we actually concern ourselves with like checking the impedance all the time, or should we just like work with the signal and try to do something with that?
Yeah, I think both both approaches are valid. I mean, in the end, the signal is what you're really using. So I think if you have good measures to check if the frequency, amplitude range, and so on are valid for EEG, and you can measure the typical artifacts, the typical EEG signals, then that should be good enough, especially for consumer grade PCIs. But I think for most PCIs, the issue is that they're not checking at all if it's an artifact or EEG signal.
Okay. And do you think that invasive BCIs are the future of consumer products?
I don't know. I'm not too convinced by that, because I wouldn't like to go for a surgery to get a BCI implanted. Also, like not only because of distrust, also because like it's kind of risky, like inflammation and all this stuff. Like we do invasive BCIs, one of the major risks is that people get inflammation, and that's very dangerous at some point. So I don't know if everything that's not belonging to the body could trigger a reaction, and that's kind of risky. So if there's no medical indication, I myself personally, I wouldn't like to do that for just entertainment or whatever.
Yeah, so maybe it really will depend on the person. And I do see that you have Oscar here, right? You can
Yeah,
like just turn on the filter. Yeah, I think that's so great.
so it will take about 10 seconds until calibrated. And that's the artifact removal tool. So previously I showed the eye blinks and all that stuff, but if I'm doing that with Oscar, that is basically removed. Like on the right-hand side, you can see the signal is actually turning bad if I'm moving my head, but Oscar can recover a lot of the signals. And it's trying to remain most of the useful BCI signals. So that's the artifact removal algorithm that one of our signal processing experts developed. Yeah, that's a
Yeah,
very
it's
nice add-on,
amazing.
especially for dry EEG and so on. But the challenging part is to remain as much BCI accuracy as possible and as much signals as possible, and still cleaning it up nicely.
And do you know how long did it take to like create this filter? Because it seems like a big undertaking just to like make it.
Yeah, I don't know exactly, but I think we're talking for about 2 years, 1.5, 2 years,
Mhm.
um, probably a bit longer. So it's easy to make something look nice quickly, but you need a lot of validations and tests to check if it's actually still working for PCI systems and so on. And that's what Johannes and Sebastian are doing for the last 2 years very intensely to check if they can preserve PCI accuracy for visual evoked potentials and audio evoked potentials and all kind of things. That's why there are likely going to be more and more iterations of this algorithm.
Okay, thank you. I don't think that we have any more questions left. So yeah, thank you for the lecture. It was really interesting, and yeah, I actually like love the quality signal. It's really nice.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me.